Well, thank you. I don't see this as being a very formal talk today. I'm going to try and keep it as informal as possible. I want to give you a little bit of history about what I do and kind of where I've come from. And this work is a real point of departure for me. This body of work in the show has been developed over about the last 18 months. And I have a whole history of work that has fed into making this project and has really informed what I do. My background is in ceramics, and I was a ceramics professor and worked exclusively in clay for about 25 years. It was fired clay. These are not fired clay. I mean, there's still a little bit of that clay look here, but I'll talk about that. But I moved away from that a little over a decade ago and tried to change what I do in the studio. And what I wanted was to make the studio a real adventure again. I had worked representationally, so I was working with a figure in a surrealist and a narrative direction. They were carefully planned pieces that were difficult to build, difficult to fire, difficult to move. And I just felt the need to make something different from that. Tried a number of different things. I had a little foray into glass casting. That was maybe even worse than the ceramics in terms of the technical side of things, but an incredibly beautiful material. And but I wanted to get to a place where I didn't know what I was doing in the studio, and I thought that might be a challenge that would be good for me, and also maybe open up something that was unexpected. And so with that, with trying to come up with something I didn't know what I was doing, I had to pretty much toss out everything I knew, and little by little I did that. And the first thing I did was get rid of the figure and the recognizable imagery, and I worked with juxtaposition was a major strategy that I worked with. I would combine bits of the figure, like a hand or a head or feet, and with objects from domestic interiors, blenders, toasters, telephones, things like that. Put them together in unexpected ways. So this idea of incongruous elements coming together in a piece was something that has been with me for decades, really. That's okay. Let's see, where was I? Coming together. So I took that strategy, brought it into glass initially, but on a much smaller scale and a much less diverse palette in terms of color. These are monochromatic pieces. And I just thought, okay, well, I've gotten rid of my familiar material, but I haven't really gotten rid of the familiar forms that I was working with. And I was really trying to get to the unknown. I said, well, the form is really the most important part in many ways. And so I said, okay, I've got to just kind of really get outside the figure, give up the recognizable imagery, and see where that takes me. And I had admired abstract work. I never really thought that was something that I was going to pursue, but I just realized to get to someplace unexpected, I was going to have to give that up as well. That was a major transition for me. And I made some pieces more or less successful. I discovered some new materials. I was experimenting, and I came across this epoxy putty that I really liked working with and tried to figure out how to work with it. And it has some qualities that are very much like clay, but you don't have to fire it, but you can't build with it the same way. And what I realized, the best way for me to use it that I came up with was to use it as a skin over some type of skeletal structure. I used wire and wood and some other materials. And then I started, I really wanted to define the shapes more. And volumes had always been really important to me, and I wanted to bring that into the work. So I started working with polystyrene and carving the polystyrene into shapes, and then coating it with this epoxy putty and painting it. And that was good. That was probably a couple years worth of work in that direction. And, you know, I had a situation where, you know, my father had passed away. I was cleaning out his house, and when I went to his closet, I realized he had never gotten rid of any of his neckties and had a whole professional life of wearing probably a different necktie every day. And I figured this was almost like the history of his life here. And I said, I can't just give this to Goodwill. This is so representative of him. And I took them back to my studio and I tried to figure out what could I do with them. And it was a real stumbling point for me. I couldn't really figure out what to do with them. And I had a few starts, some false starts, and worked with them for off and on for a couple of years. And finally, I came up with a strategy for using them in the work. And I was building solid forms, and I started opening up little cavities in the pieces where I could insert some of these necktie pieces. And actually, let me back up a second, because I decided, okay, I was not able to use the entire necktie. And I really thought this necktie was probably going to result in about 3 pieces. You know, myself and my 2 sisters would probably each own one of these pieces. And I thought it would be 3 memorial pieces that would come out of this. Well, when I realized I had to work with fragments rather than the whole necktie, I started cutting them up, and I had this like profound emotional experience when I started cutting up my dad's ties, and it brought back all these memories. And I said, you know, nothing like that has ever really happened to me in the studio before. And at that point, I thought, okay, these are potent. They're potent images. There's potent material to work with here, and I started working with it, and there just wasn't enough formal variety with the ties. And so I said, okay, well, what else can I use? Well, my family, my wife had made dresses and shirts and quilts, and we had a basket full of sewing scrap. And I said, okay, I'll take the sewing scrap to the studio and use that. And I started mixing the two together. And then I had a much wider palette, and it was starting to go someplace. And I opened up these little cavities in these solid forms and inset these collage-like fabric insets. And they were going along really, it was going somewhere, and I was excited about it. But one of the things that I was really trying to do with my work in general was to move away from anything that was referential. I wanted to, I didn't want a narrative. I didn't want anything recognizable. And I just felt like this is getting to become autobiographical in a way. It's about me and my family and my father, and it really wasn't what I was after with the work. I didn't want that kind of personal narrative to it. I wanted to use it in a more formal way. And I also, you know, maybe in a more anonymous way. And I started, said, okay, well, I'll find other material to work with. So I started going around to estate sales and thrift shops and collecting materials. Some found textiles. One of the things I was really excited about, I came to realize that there are a lot of people who use fabric and make things with it and have these incredible fabric stashes, and something happens to them at some point after they're no longer with us, that people are trying to get rid of these fabric stashes. And I collected some of those, and it really got me thinking about fabric and textiles and how personal it is, because people they make decisions constantly about what the fabric is that they're selecting. If it's some of the items that I was using were clothing, you know, those were not only selected, but then they were worn, and they have this really close connection to people. And those were kind of interesting thoughts that were floating in the back of my mind as I was working on these pieces in the studio. And I thought the work was developing, and again, these were just really small little insets of these fabric pieces. And I said, well, gosh, there are so many ways to acquire things these days that instead of just going to estate sales, I could get onto a virtual estate sale on the internet. And I found people all over the world who were selling fabric scraps, and found someone in Japan who was taking apart these vintage kimonos, and you could buy a sleeve or panels out of the kimonos. And when they got to me, I realized these are like incredibly beautiful materials. Some of them were, more than 50 years old, and they had this whole history of use to them. Started using some of those. I found some Dutch wax fabrics that also had just kind of a different presence that I wanted to integrate in the work. And I began to think about it as somewhat in a miniature form, but as a melting pot of material that was my own personal material that I was mixing with materials from all over the place. And I really saw it as a kind of a global melting pot within these little cavities of these pieces. And when I started with it, the fabric was really a minor element. It wasn't a major part of the piece. But as I got more involved with looking for fabric and collecting it, I let it become more of a major part of the piece. And funny things started happening. Some people would hear about this and would start sending me their fabrics. I had a friend from long ago who retired, and on his retirement, he sent me a box of his neckties. He said, okay, you work with these. And another friend was cleaning out her father's house and sent me neckties from her father. And all of a sudden, I started acquiring these fabrics that were just kind of coming to me. And so at that point, I said, well, I would really like to make that more of what these pieces are about. And but I wasn't really sure how to go about doing that. And I started experimenting. I knew mostly, coming from my background, I didn't want to make something that was a narrative. I didn't want to make something representational. But there were things about my work that, I really wanted to keep in the work. And this idea of juxtaposition, where you put something next to each other, two things next to each other which don't normally go together. And somehow that coaxes a new meaning just from their proximity. And so I thought that might be a strategy that I can use in the work. And I also was really interested in painting. I look a lot at painting. And so I said, okay, I want to make these more painting-like. So I flattened things out, put them on the wall, and tried to think about, could I construct a painting? And building and making is been really the central part of my practice for many decades. And so I thought, okay, well, if I was going to make a painting, construct a painting, what would that be if I wasn't using just painting materials? And could I use other materials, conventional art, craft materials and found materials as a painting substitute? And this idea of substitution was something that also had been part of my work. I would substitute an item like a blender in a figurative piece. It might take the place of the head. So I would have a bust with a blender on top, and this idea of substitution. Here I was thinking, okay, maybe I can substitute some material for paint. And it got me thinking about something that I had read decades before that had stuck with me, an article, and where this critic, Rose Slivka, had written about this body of work that was being done in ceramics, and it was this kind of a celebration of abstract expressionism in ceramics that was taking place. And this was a really interesting article, and for me really important, and also very controversial, because it was about people who were taking beautiful pots and then messing with them and marking them and cutting them, oftentimes making them non-usable. But what she noticed was that there was this correspondence between the approach that abstract painters were taking in this group of potters on the West Coast, and found similarities in their work, and the way they just approached it, that the potters were using clay as if it were paint, and the painters were working with paint in very thick ways as if it were almost like a viscous clay material. That's something that just kind of been in the back of my thinking for a long, long time. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to approach these more as like a painting rather than as a sculpture or craft object. And so as I developed this, I started thinking about intersections and juxtaposition. And I thought, okay, well, the intersection between painting, sculpture, and craft, that would be a really interesting area to explore. And that's what I set out to do. I slowly began that with that first group of fabric, and I wanted to capitalize on the fabric. I opened up the forms even more. So these pieces, just a couple of years ago, were mostly solid with little holes that you could see through. I opened up more and more of the form so you could see inside the form. And I really kind of thought of this as a kind of a skeleton-skin relationship. So there's this structure and then this clay material on top of it that's very textural. And as I opened it up more and more, they were taking lots of fabric collage. And as you can tell, the fabric collage, they're built up in layers, and they're kind of chaotic, and they're really intense to look at. And I got to a point where there's so much going on that I wanted to find a way just to isolate and quiet down the work a little bit. And so I needed something else to happen. And about 2 years ago, maybe, I started experimenting with felting, and that also presented some possibilities. And I just kind of pushed that more and more in the work. And this is what came out of all of that. And this is, again, about 18 months worth of work. And the felting, which I never initially, again, that was in little bits. That became more and more an element of the work until it's kind of a primary element in these pieces. Each one is an abstract composition. I'm not trying to think of them as telling a story. I hope they're their own thing, whatever that thing is, but what I really want is to get people to kind of slow down and look at them. And I think we have these incredibly busy lives where we don't stop and look at details in the world and just appreciate things for what they are. We have no ability to experience the kind of pleasure of looking. And so as I'm developing the work, they take some time to develop, and I really focus in on details and nuances, and hopefully give people, visual food for thought, something to really kind of draw you in, slow down, take some time and look. And parts of it can be read really easily from a distance. The overall form, I think, and parts of it are really complicated and take a lot of close looking. And that's really what I think these are all about. I think they're just about that experience of that conversation that takes place when you slow down, look at the materials, and think about things like, when you know my story, that there's this remixing that's taken place in the work of these personal materials with these materials from around the world, and that might suggest certain things to you. And hopefully, you know, I think that there's somewhat of an archaeological experience that can happen with these things, that you know, there's this outer skin and you could look at that and it's very textural and physical, and then there's these layers, and the innermost layer, which I think of as the substratum, and that's the title of the show, is this, for me, very important fabric collage that I developed. I would love to, if anyone has some questions.
Okay, I had two questions. My first question is, how did you approach each individual piece in the collection? Like, were you kind of just going with the flow? Was there a specific look that you wanted and sort of like making each piece look different? Like, how did you approach that?
Well, I definitely want to have variety in the work. I don't want to just repeat a shape over and over again. So I'm constantly looking for new shapes. And the way I work in the studio is I do a lot of thumbnail sketching. So I have a book with possible shapes, and when I start on a new piece, I'll select one and I'll try and push it and see if it actually works, because there's this huge change that happens when you go from your two-dimensional drawing to your three-dimensional object, and some of them work and some of them just need a lot of change, and some of them need to be discarded. And so I think part of that is just evolution over time. You know, I'll make one piece and it will suggest something to me, and I'll try and push that in a different direction. And every once in a while I'll do a couple that are similar, like these two pieces over here. They're relatively similar. There's two on the back wall as well. So I'll have an idea and, you know, I'll make the form, but there's so many elements there. There's the overall shape. There's the, you know, how I decide to open up the form. We can do that in different ways. What shape the collage component is going to take. Then the color choices there's just like a lot of possibilities with what can happen with these pieces. But I think in this show, even just in terms of developing work for the show, I definitely was thinking about how pieces might work together and develop some sort of a conversation. I think they all stand on their own, but there's something about, I didn't want it to be like a show where you come in and see, you know, a bunch of discs on the wall that are all like 2 foot wide discs. I wanted there to be some form variety. And also wanted the color variety as well. You know, I think a lot of this, and one of the things that you may notice is that I've tried to abandon the body and the figure, but it just keeps creeping back into my work. And hopefully it's not like overpowering, but all of a sudden I might not even realize I'm doing it, but I'll say, oh yeah, that really has figurative qualities. And I worked with little small bits of the figure. You know, it might be a part of the face or a hand. And like for instance, this one, I really start to see the figure coming back in. Wasn't at all my intent, and it probably was only when I had, you know, dozens of hours into the piece where I realized, okay, there's some figure coming back into that piece, or it's already there. So yeah, it happens in lots of different ways.
Thank you.
You have another question?
Yeah, I just had one more. What would you say was the most difficult or challenging aspect of the process of creating this whole collection? Well,
I don't know. I think hopefully some parts are, maybe everything's difficult, but I think like a lot of artists, I like to solve problems. So, you know, I'm not trying to repeat myself, and I've got a few known things that I work with, but there are not that many. And so every time it seems like a new problem. I mean, maybe it seems like there's a serial solution going on here, but I really find that there's so many variables that I don't know what I'm doing on each piece. I really want to try to work towards that. I want to try to embrace the unknown, that, and that's where it really gets exciting for me. The difficult part, part of it is difficult with labor. The shell of this material, the material I use has about a 90-minute working life. So I work in little bits and work around the form from back to the front. And so I'm trying to guess what the overall texture is going to be, but I might only see, a little section of it like that. And so hopefully I'm getting it right. And every once in a while I'll have to cut off. I'll start really, so that's the wrong texture for that piece. And one of the nice things is I can actually just cut it off and put a new texture on there. But that's physically unpleasant for me to do. I don't like working with this material that much, but I want the effect of it. So that's a challenge. The wool is, it's all needle felted with little tools. And I don't know if anyone knows needle felting, but it's raw wool and you're compressing it with a needle by stabbing it repeatedly. And, my arm just gets tired. It's, if I do it too much in a day, I can really feel it. And so that part has a bit of difficulty as well. But I think the hardest thing is just is to get all these different elements to work together in the piece. And that is the biggest challenge. Hopefully I get it right, but
Thank you.
Hi, Allan.
Hey.
I really appreciate all of the different shapes that are happening in here. And I'm seeing, transitions and experiments in your material. And so just hearing you talk about that experimentation and that opportunity that you give yourself to fail and then restart feels like a really generous part of your creative process. So I can really appreciate that from sort of the area that, we don't have access to that. So I appreciate really hearing that because, I can't see that generosity necessarily. It's like it's hidden. And
Sure,
so
and you don't see what
I
is
don't.
not here.
Yeah, exactly. I can't see that. So it feels like that foundationally is really part of this building up. And there's a couple things I wanted to ask about. I feel like I'm seeing, in some ways, we're all going to have different interpretations of the work.
Absolutely.
And I feel like I'm seeing things that are opening. It feels like they're being spread apart and they're coming out. And then I'm seeing over here, it's almost as if in the back wall, it feels like the shell has moved from the perimeter and is being pulled toward the center as if it's like bursting out of its sides. Is this a different direction, or do you feel like that's a new direction for it? I'm curious. I have many questions.
If I'll talk about that wall, because it's kind of unusual in a sense that the piece in the center is the last piece I made. It's the most recent. And the pieces that flank it are the earliest pieces in the show. And so I think, a lot has happened from those pieces where I just started to get into the possibilities of felt, trying to figure that out. And I wasn't opening up the form very much on those two smaller pieces. And the pieces before that, and those were opened up a lot more than the work before that. Before it was literally like a 3-inch circle that I was opening up. And so many things I think in sculpting in particular is it's somewhat of a combination of what you want and what the engineering will allow, and just realizing that I could actually open up a form. Because I had worked in ceramics, everything has to be, you need it for integrity many times. It's just a solid shell. Just to be able to have a big open cavity was something that was new to me. And so I think that piece in the center is where I've really gotten to a point of kind of opening it up and also just really letting the will kind of take over in a major way. But part of what you might be thinking about is, this collage piece in the center, and I kind of see that as the innermost layer. So everything else is kind of surrounding that, and everything else might be there in kind of a supporting role to that center collage. And the center collage, I'm trying not to have meaning in the work, but all of a sudden that does have some meaning. I mean, it has like these associations for me personally, but there's this like a global remixing that's taking place, and personal and private, and I think I found meaning and material with that section. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
I mean, I think we're, it's very conversational, and I do feel like there is something emerging from this, and there's so much information that's embedded within that center textile piece, within that collage. I feel like it's almost as if it's being uncovered. So I want to see more, and so there's a whole experience back there that's happening for me.
Yeah, and I think I have made pieces that had a whole lot of that collage just before this body of work, and part of it was really exciting, and but it's in a way it's a little bit overwhelming too. I think that it's kind of one of those things that when you just have a little glimpse of something, it makes you curious, and I think this idea of curiosity is something that I find really compelling in art. Like, I make it because I'm curious to see it, but how do you get a viewer to be curious about looking at your work? And if you have something to peer into, everybody likes to peer into little openings, and I just wanted to have this subworld going on in there, and I've tried to really set that off in this body of work. And sometimes it's one of those things. It's probably an old cliche, but less can be more. Mm-hmm. And so when I had a lot of that, it almost diminished what was going on there. But by just putting little bits of it in there, it all of a sudden makes it really a lot more important. And it's a funny balance. You think, okay, well, these are going to become more important if I put less of it in there. And
it makes me want to investigate it more. So I'm really drawn to the patterning that's happening inside and how it references the exterior shell. So I'm very much interested in that relationship of exterior, interior, macro, micro, and for this piece in particular, some of them there. I feel like I'm looking at a cell structure, biology, and it's like it's a different worldscape, and so I'm definitely getting those pulls, and it's what happens if we keep going into the interiority of it, and like what information is that going to give me, what narrative, and it's allowing me to come up with my own narrative about it, which I appreciate. I know where it started, and with your father's neckties, and I appreciate that became almost too intense or too specifically narrative to continue with that. So I can really see how this has opened up a whole new arena.
So many things inform what you make, and so the history of these materials is one thing, but one of the things that I have enjoyed looking at are these microscopic photographs and of seeds and molds, and they're like incredibly beautiful structures, and I think that that has played a role in the look of these pieces. It's part of that stew that is inside you that, okay, well, I'll draw from that. And, a little bit of looking at microscopic photographs, a little bit of looking at, Hilma af Klint paintings, listening to some kind of jazz music, and somehow it all sort of, you put it into the blender, it all gets mixed up, and hopefully something comes out of that. And yeah, so I think the kind of micro, macro, this idea of juxtapositions has been with me forever, in putting these dissimilar things together. So this might be that kind of really close-up view, that micro view that you would have, but then you get back, pull back, and you can see the bigger picture and the macro. Yeah, that always has fascinated me. And then with these in particular is trying to think about some formal relationships, both in terms of color, but line to shape. And do you want to emphasize the shape with line? Do you want to negate it? You know, how do you want to deal with that? And then then there's all sorts of technical possibilities as well, and what you can do, what you'd like to do. It's
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm hoping someone else has questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's about the structure.
Yes.
So if you were to like slice them, what would they look like inside? Are they feel like they have a lightness to them
Well, they're
because of their
incredibly
curved
light.
edges, but I feel like I'm being duped. Like maybe they're actually very solid.
They're solid. Okay, but they're solid and light at the same time because they have each one has a solid core, and that's where I start out. I carve. I start out with basically it's building insulation. It's polystyrene blocks, and I glue blocks together, and then I cut shapes and carve it into what I want. And once I have that polystyrene shape, then I begin to work on it, and I'll go from the polystyrene shape, which weighs nothing, to just a skin of this epoxy putty on top of it, and get the epoxy putty done. So if you cut it in half, you see this white polystyrene core, and with this shell on the outside. And I work from the epoxy putty to then I develop the collage, and when that is all, I paint the epoxy first, and then when the collage is done, then I begin to add the wool. That's the last step that I do. But they are, if you know ceramics at all, I mean, everyone's held ceramics, so you know they have a visual weight. If you think about this as a textured clay surface, you think, okay, that weighs a good amount. These weigh just a fraction of that. It's almost all air. It's fun that way because I made a lot of big, heavy, hard to move, fragile pieces, and then coming in having pieces that I can pick up myself and hang on a wall pretty easily. Like if this were a clay piece that you're hanging on the wall, you'd really have to. It would take some engineering and a lot more. I mean, these take a little bit of engineering, but a clay piece would take a lot more of engineering.
So I just thought of one other question because you were talking about how they started out really small with just the collage.
Yeah.
And these are a really nice size. Do you picture yourself going larger with them, or what direction do you see these going?
Well, I like this size, but I want to make some bigger pieces as well. So I definitely have plans for some bigger works. It becomes some technical complications, and I've already gone beyond the width of my material, so I've got to sandwich it together and then make a bigger piece and then cut it out of that. But I think these can go quite large. They're light enough in the end that they can become pretty large. One thing I do is, I know many artists work in teams where they have people there to help them, but I'm a solo artist, so I work by myself, and I had gotten to the point in ceramics where it was almost impossible for me to pick up and move something myself, and when I worked in glass, I was dependent upon other people to help me complete my pieces, and one of my goals was to be able to make a piece from start to finish myself and not have to bring other people into the process. And so, I'll go bigger, but I want to be able to handle it as well. And Yeah. But the material, I mean, it can go, there's no limit really. I mean, it could be quite large. Now, it's not an inexpensive material either, so that might be something that I would think about. But yeah, I'm probably not going too much smaller. I think this is these recent pieces they feel about the right size.
So was it intentional to take the shape of like forms? See? So if you look at that one, it looks like there's the upper half of a body, arms, head. And then if you look on that one, it kind of looks like a stamper. And then if you look on that one, it looks like a gaming controller. And then that one looks like a robot, and that one looks like a bug. Was that intentional?
Well, it wasn't. That was a great question. Thank you. It wasn't completely intentional, but sometimes things happen in a subliminal way. So you're not thinking about them there, but they're in your thought process, and they just come out. And I try to, in my studio, I try to open the door to let those things that are kind of hidden inside me just come out in the work. So the body, as you saw, that was part of my work for a really long time, so that it keeps coming out. And even though I'm not trying to do it, it just happens automatically. The gaming controller, I think some of the things that they may be partly I'm putting in there, and what I hope happens with the work is that there presents possibilities. So there's a suggestion that someone who's looking more at a gaming controller might see a gaming controller, another person might see a different thing. So I think of them as suggestions or prompts that will allow you to look at them and interpret them in your own personal way. And there's no right or wrong way to do it, but I really love when, you're not the first person who's told me gaming controller, but that was not at all in my thinking when I started on that. And people just last week at the show, people were seeing like COVID-19 references, and there was a dermatologist who saw these skin problems in here, and it just, people see different things in the work, and that's what I find that to be really exciting.
My second question was, how do you feel about these beautiful shadows? Like, they seem to form and take shape. Like, how do you feel about that? Like, how do you feel about the shadow being bigger than the piece of work and being smaller at the same time?
Well, that's a great question again, and I love shadows. And one of the things that I should probably give you a little bit of background, because when I started working with this material, I worked only in black and white, and I made these wire shapes that came off the pieces, and they would cast these really intricate shadows. So I spent a whole couple of years making this black and white work with these structures that would cast shadows, and it was all about the shadows. And I really liked the fact that they were ephemeral, that the shadows would change every time I put them from one gallery to the next gallery. It would be like a new drawing on the wall, and it was only there for the time it was in that gallery, because if I put this piece in another room, it would have a different shadow. And one of the things that, when I was installing the show that we were looking at, is that there were these layers of shadows here. And that was a total surprise to me. And, you know, I immediately noticed it. We were all talking about it. And my studio has LED fluorescent lights. I don't really get shadows in the studio. There's so much light and it's so even. So this was just a real treat and a total surprise. I love it, actually. Yeah, I'm glad you noticed that. Yeah. Awesome. Any other questions? Guys, thank you so much. Yeah.